Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our special meeting for Monday, August the 15th. It is 5:27 and I will call the meeting to order. There is only one item on the agenda, the reading of a notice of motion. Councillor Gullickson. Having not done many special meetings, do we still need to go through and approve the agenda and whatnot, or can we go directly to the item, Chief Gowdy? Still to go, very good. Councillor Hibbs.
I can make the motion to accept the agenda as presented.
Thank you. Any discussion? All those in favor? Thank you. It is unanimous. So all the way down to item number 7.1, as brought forward by Councillor Gullickson. For notices of motion, Councillor Gullickson, would you care to read that into the record for us, please?
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. I have a notice of motion that council reconsider motion 31-621.04.22. Motion passed April 25th, 2022. And it's to be considered on the 15th, is that correct? Yes. April 15th, do I have to say, or August 22nd is when it'll be considered? Okay.
Councillor Gullickson, I appreciate your question, but let's read the motion or your notice of motion in its entirety so we don't confuse anyone, please.
That was the entirety, because the balance of it is not part of the motion. I don't think. Is that not correct?
That was different than the information that I got, but I will refer to our legislative coordinator, Bella Bono.
If we can have the regarding which motion you're wanting them to reconsider for the minutes.
So you want me to read the balance of that? That's on there? Okay. All right, I'll do it again. Thank you very much. That council reconsider motion 31/621.04.22 MO passed April 25th, 2022. Read that council direct administration to tender the public works facility project as design build.
Thank you. Does anyone have any process related questions only? Very good. Then I believe that is all that we have on our special meeting agenda for this evening. So if I could have a motion, please. Councillor Hoekstra.
I'll move that we adjourn this special meeting.
Thank you very much. All those in favor? That is unanimous. Thank you. Very good. Moving right into our regularly scheduled events for this evening, the Committee of the Whole meeting once again for Monday, August 15th. It is now 5:31 and I will call the meeting to order. Got the agenda before you. Councillor Hibbs.
I'm not aware of any additions, so I would move that the agenda be adopted as presented.
Thank you. Anyone else? All those in favor? Agenda is adopted. Thank you. And we will move right into presentations. Item 3.1 for the economic analysis update. Senior Manager McKinnon has brought forward some presenters for us here. Welcome, gentlemen, Mr. James Hobson and Chart Chahal with the Hobson-Chahal Advisory Group. Welcome to City Hall once again. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and good evening, Mayor and Council. Just by way of background for those of you that don't know us, we've been managing the city's long-term investment reserves for just over 2 years now. We are the only institutional-only focused team within the Wood-Gundy network, and we specialize on municipal investments. So right now we work with 55 municipalities in the province, all with very similar concerns as yourselves. And we've been doing dozens of these council updates lately because the world has changed materially. I'm sure all of you are starting to notice it with your decisions, even personally. So we want to give you an economic update, and we hope that this helps guide your decisions as we move forward here. So I'm going to jump right into it, and we're going to start out just talking about inflation. This is the hot topic basically with every household now, and certainly in our industry. It's what the central banks are all focused on, is how do we get inflation under control. So the best place to start when we're trying to understand how did we get here with inflation is to look at supply chain bottlenecks. And I'm sure you're starting to notice it with your capital projects that these supply chain problems have been very stubborn. And these are kind of the factors that have played into that. So the first one would be that the world wasn't set up for this massive shock that was COVID. The supply chains were built on just-in-time inventories. Companies like Walmart, Amazon, they don't hold inventory like they used to. It's built to order and just in time to meet needs. So that's been a big issue. Manufacturing production chains are very complex now. We had the toilet paper problem, which was just people hoarding goods. Lack of excess capacity. So production chains weren't designed to meet these sudden shocks that was COVID. The other thing that's come into play, and I'll get into this in a little bit, is resistance to paying market wages. So while we talk about regular inflation, which is the cost of everything that we do, wage inflation is sort of that insidious thing that keeps popping up, and I think it's going to start to impact the municipality moving forward. COVID-19, obviously, factory shutdowns, China's zero COVID policy that really threw a wrench in the works, and then on top of that, we had the war in Ukraine. So naturally, food supply chains, everyone's aware, and then the volatility in energy markets. And last but not least, just a shortage in labor for long haul trucking. So this chart is kind of one to focus on. This shows you the US CPI, which is inflation, and Canada would trend almost identically to this. We're at a 40-year high for inflation. So I haven't experienced this. Some of you that lived through the 80s will have experienced this, but inflation, we've peaked over 8% now, year over year, which is material when you consider that the central bank target is only 2%. So we're 4 times higher than what the central bank would like to see. What this chart here shows you, the blue line is where the inflation reading actually is. And the black line is the one we want to kind of highlight for you. It looks like it's peaked. And this would be your inflation if you strip out food and you strip out energy. So energy and food have obviously spiked materially in the last few months with this war in Ukraine. But if we strip out those components, we believe we've kind of seen the peak in terms of year over year change. And we see this coming through in the data. So last week, Canadian CPI came out, kind of shocked the market because there was basically no month over month change. So this massive ramp up that we saw, the concern was that it would just keep on going and get out of hand. But it looks like things have actually peaked and have started to come back down, which is a good sign. So how does this situation differ from what happened in the 70s and 80s? This shows you inflation going back to the 70s. And you can see on the far right there, that dotted line is PC inflation, just how big of a shock this has been. So the difference between now and back in the 80s was the central banks didn't have an inflation target. They weren't targeting 2% inflation, so they weren't moving rates around at the time in an attempt to keep inflation around 2%. And as you can see, between the mid 80s and before COVID, they did a pretty good job of keeping inflation anchored around that 2%. Yes, it fluctuated a bit, but it never really got out of control like it has recently. But in reality, monetary policy will always be the main tool that we can use to fight inflation, and that's what we're seeing as a result. So the other thing that caused this massive spike in inflation is spending on goods. So during COVID, federal governments doled out hundreds of billions of dollars in stimulus. People were stuck at home and they started to spend on goods. So on the left there, it shows you US goods inflation peaked around 13%, which is significant, especially when you compare it to the average over the last decade, which is around 1%. So 13 times more spending, more goods inflation than normal. So yeah, the charts here on the right there, it just shows you the magnitude of the increase in spending on goods relative to that pre-pandemic trend. So on the next slide, I'm going to get into wage inflation. So this is something, for the first time ever, municipalities are having to compete with the private sector to attract and retain good talent. A lot of municipalities we work with are starting to see people leave to go work in private industry, because the reality is that chart on the left shows you there's been a huge uptick in retirements, not just in Canada, but globally. So the chart on the left shows you the change in the labor force that we would need to reach pre-pandemic levels. And as you can see, in basically most age groups, it's pretty minimal, but in the 55 plus segment, that's where we're really lacking. And in response, what companies have done, and not just private sector, but also public sector, is raise wages. So the labor market right now, especially in the US, but also in Alberta, is very tight. It's hard to attract and retain good talent. So companies naturally will start to fork over more cash to attract and retain the right people. So that's something that you're going to have to keep in mind as we move forward here in this next cycle. So I talked about goods spending and how the inflation rate on goods was 13%. Most of that happened during COVID. The chart on the left there just shows you that goods spending has started to moderate. These higher interest rates are starting to impact households. We're paying more on our mortgages, on our auto loans, on our lines of credit. So people are spending less on goods. And then on the right there, it shows you basically that the COVID recession was more of a service sector recession. It was people locked at home. They couldn't eat out. They couldn't travel. And those are the sectors that you would expect to rebound over the coming year or two. And then, so I kind of walked through US inflation. This is kind of breaking down Canadian inflation. The orange chunk there is a huge chunk, and that's housing prices. So if by some measures, depending on what you look at, housing affordability has reached its worst on record. The cost of owning a home, the cost of renting a home is really, really starting to impact consumers. And that's something that I'll get into a bit later, but that is a big chunk of it. Supply chains, I kind of talked about. If you've tried to order a couch or a dishwasher, it can take 6 months to a year to get it. Speaking as someone that's ordered a couch 6 months ago. Not last but not least, this is impacting people, food and energy, obviously. Energy, good for Alberta, clearly, which chart we'll get into later. But those are kind of the main factors that are causing inflation, but it's not just on a personal level. It's started to impact municipalities. Capital projects are getting delayed. Things are coming in materially higher than we expected. I talked about competing with the private sector for the first time, and it won't be unique to City of Lacombe. We work with 12 cities, and they're all coming to us with the same problem. The cost of all of our projects has gone up. The reality is, even if inflation normalizes in the next couple of years, let's say it normalizes back to 2%, the damage has already been done. We've already seen year-over-year inflation as of the last print of 8%. So the cost of everything has jumped, and we need to respond to it. So our advice really would be to rely heavily on administration, would be kind of the standing advice we give to municipalities, is because they have kind of on-the-ground information that you can use for your capital budgeting decisions. So we do believe inflation has peaked, but it's still going to be a problem because our revenues haven't adjusted yet to reflect those higher costs. So I'm going to get into what central banks have done in response. It was kind of like a whoopsie moment. They left rates so low for so long. They saw inflation ramp up, and all of a sudden they're hiking interest rates faster and higher than they did in any prior cycle. So if you have a credit line, you've probably noticed that your monthly payments are going up, as I have. And so we see the central banks. This chart is just basically showing you that in US and Canada, they're going to hike rates, and they have hiked rates higher and faster than they have in the past. And specifically for Canada, Canada is more sensitive to higher interest rates than the US. The reason being, in the US, you can lock into a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. In Canada, we typically have 5-year resets, so it starts to impact consumers a lot faster. So the left there just shows you the impact of a 100 basis point increase. So 1% increase in the overnight rate should slow consumer spending by 2%. That doesn't sound like a lot, but if consumer spending is 70% of the economy. That's pretty material. And then on the right there, it's just illustrating that Canadians are more sensitive to higher interest rates than the US. In terms of housing, we saw that kind of rush into housing as people anticipated interest rates moving higher on their mortgages. So we saw this kind of boom, particularly in Alberta. And it's obviously a large component of inflation. The good news for households is that we have kind of seen it peak, and it's become obviously more difficult to qualify for mortgages because rates are higher. So the stress test that you have to go through as a household is higher. So we are seeing a bit more of a balanced market now, which again leads to that theory that inflation probably has peaked.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Before you move on, with respect to the housing, is that for the nation as a whole, or did you make it specific to Alberta or our area? 'Cause I think we can all agree that most of the housing numbers are substantially skewed because of the major centers in our country. I'm just curious what data that is from.
Great comment, Mr. Mayor. Did you have?
Yeah, so what you're looking at is the national average. I have a slide later on that will talk about housing starts by province, and it kind of breaks it out for you. So yeah, I don't want to jump ahead, but we do dig into that as
Well, I
well.
would say just to quickly touch on it, that yes, so like Toronto, Vancouver, grossly skewing those numbers. The good news for homeowners in Alberta is we are buoyed a lot more by higher energy prices. So we are seeing people just anecdotally migrate from those major centers of Vancouver and Toronto. They're looking for places like Lacombe to live because you can buy a house not for $1 million on average like you do in Toronto. People are moving to, and especially people that can work remotely now too, right? You can unlock half your home value and buy the same house here in Alberta. So I think in terms of a pullback in housing, I think Alberta is going to hold up quite well, but it's more just on average, those crazy spikes that you saw in Toronto, Vancouver, it's kind of coming home to roost for people that over levered in Toronto and Vancouver. But we'll get more into that as Chart mentioned. Not to kind of beat it to death on interest rates. This is a lot of data, but there's two lines to look at. The top line is the overnight rate. That's Bank of Canada's what they set to try and combat inflation. Right now we're around 2.5%. We see them hiking up to 3.25% and then stopping. So most of the hikes have already been done. They're going to hike probably by 50 or 75 basis points next month and then stay there. That should be enough to start to slow things as we're starting to see in the data. The other thing to point out would be that 10-year government bond line. We saw, trust me, it was not fun navigating $3 billion through this environment. We saw the fastest, sharpest uptick in interest rates on bonds on record. So the 10-year Canada bond went from 0.6 to 3.6 in a matter of 6 months. That's 300 basis points, which, trust, I've been doing it 15 years. I've never seen a move that would normally take years to occur. What is interesting, or how it affects the city, is our expected investment revenues are moving materially higher over the next few years because we can reinvest those maturities and cash flow payments at much higher interest rates. So just to put it in perspective, a year ago, we'd be happy if we got 2.5 on a bond, 2.5%. We just launched one last week at 8.5% on a principal guaranteed bond. So it is something we work closely with administration on, optimizing those cash flows, making sure that we're shielded as much as we can from inflation and generating as much as we can on the investment reserves. And the last chart for me here is the yield curve. We always put a yield curve in our presentations because it has a lot of forecasting, a lot of good information in it. It looks as wonky as I've ever seen it. The dark green line, it's what we'd call an inverted yield curve. So this is the market. It's really interesting from a finance standpoint. The bond market is saying, yes, you're going to hike interest rates on the short end, but we think you're going to have to cut rates in the next few years. So we think you're going to hike rates to the point where you're going to start slowing things down, to the point where you're going to have to cut, or you're going to trigger a recession. This is just sort of the current yield curve in dark green, imposed on what it was just 2 months ago. 2 months ago, it was a positively sloped yield curve. So that is a material shift, and it certainly keeps us on our toes. But basically, the message here is that the market is saying, central banks, you're going to have to slow down. You can't keep hiking rates this fast, or you're going to cause a recession. So I'll turn it to you now.
Awesome. Thanks, James. So basically, what I'm going to get into a little bit is the impact of what James just talked about, the rising rate environment, and then more specifically what's going to happen here in Alberta, or kind of our forecast for that. So obviously it doesn't take a lot of knowledge to know that when you rise rates to kind of pull back demand, it's going to have an impact on growth. And that's exactly what we're kind of seeing in the forecast right now. Global growth is going to be slowing. The forecast for this year slowing significantly. It's continuing into next year. The two key things to take away from this chart: Canada's right in the middle of the pack. It's not very a big outlier one way or the other. But the interesting thing from the economists right now, they are not predicting a recession. Now, we may have differing views. However, the data right now, as it sits in the market, shows that there's a 30% probability of a recession in the US and Canada. That's what it's being priced in right now. Now, there's to go from like 30 to a 60 or to a recession, it's not a lot of runway to go there. That's a very narrow runway, even at 30%. So navigating into a recessionary environment is going to be tricky, especially when the US, we've had 2 negative quarters of negative growth, which by textbook definition is a recession, right? So it's a very narrow runway specifically for the US and Canada. But going back to, if I peel back the layer and go digest, like we were saying, we're looking at the national averages. Let's look specifically at Alberta and how we kind of fare next to all of our other provinces. I haven't done a positive economic update for Alberta in half a decade, so we're going to take a moment to give a positive economic update for us here in Alberta. COVID being the absolute perfect catalyst for a commodity surge at the time, with pent-up demand and global stimulus kind of being rocked out. To give you kind of context of what James talked about in terms of the global stimulus, the amount of stimulus they dished out in, I think, 3 months during the start of COVID, it took them all of the financial crisis to dull out in that short amount of time. The amount of demand that James is talking about, demand goods that got deployed in the States, in 2020, the amount of demands that was spent on demands and goods is 3 years average. That's the equivalent. I can't remember the number, but it's parachuting a significant amount of your population in. I think it's like 6 million people overnight and having them spend in your economy. So it's not a small amount of data. So Alberta, from a GDP perspective, we're going to be leading the pack. I haven't said that in a long time. We're going to be leading the pack and continuing into next year as well, and largely driven by the commodity boom. I will strip out Ukraine and Ukraine and Russia crisis and say, even without that, still leading commodity boom. Oil today trading at $88, call it around 90. If I didn't have their COVID, the Ukraine Russia crisis in there, I said $90 oil, everybody'd be pretty happy. We just saw a $130 mark, so it kind of looks like it's been pulling back. $90 oil is still a very fundamentally well-supplied price, the price of oil. Gas sitting at $8.80 as of today, same thing. You're having a very big surge in the province. I'm going to go over to the chart that says housing starts, second from the right there. Specifically, back to your question, what's happening on the housing charts? You're absolutely right, James, talking about it, where the housing starts and sales ratios are coming back on a national average. You'll see right in there that Alberta is not the national average. Alberta has always kind of been a micro economy doing its own bubble thing, while the rest of the provinces are in their own world. We've lived through quite a few amount of recessions here in this province, while Canada as a whole hasn't been in a recession for quite some time. And this, it's two-pronged, and the reason why the housing starts are going that way is absolutely what James said. The remote working is providing opportunities, I'm sure, for this municipality as well, where people can come into the municipality, unlock value of their homes. But if you look at what's happening in BC, where housing starts are starting to slow significantly, and are out in Ontario and basically on both sides of the coast there, when the government puts out $300 billion did the personal deposits. So the government stimulus, what that kind of led to was $300 billion sitting in personal deposits in Canada, an insane amount of dry powder to stimulate the economy. Everybody had all this dry powder to stimulate the economy, but as James said, it's a service sector recession. You can't actually go out and spend money in restaurants. You can't go to travel. So what did the people out in BC and Ontario do? Start buying rental properties. They started buying other secondary properties as well. So that, and when you raise interest rates, you're going to see a massive impact in those micro sessions as well. So yes, the national average is coming down, but Alberta's kind of flat to faring a little bit better because we are our own bubble within that. The same thing with inflation. Alberta is going to fare better than our other peers in terms of inflation, sitting around about just, we'll call it round up to about 6%, and then on average with where the Bank of Canada sees it at 2%. The one thing I will say about this inflation number though is 6% is goods and services inflation. It is not wage inflation. Wage inflation always tracks higher than regular, the inflation print you all see there. So when you guys are taking a look at the impact of that, I just don't want you to think that that's where that sits. It's always going to be running a little bit higher. Again, you're now competing in private sector. It's kind of a double-edged sword. Commodity prices run really high. You guys are collecting more tax revenue. There's more job and wage growth. However, they're also, as a public sector municipality, you haven't had to compete with them for a very long time. So you're benefiting on this side, but now you're competing for skilled workers on the other side. So it's a good problem to have, which we haven't had for a long time, but just one thing to keep note. Specifically for labor here in Alberta, the national average, population growth has returned to pre-pandemic levels, minus the retirement age that James is talking about. However, here in Alberta, there is still room to grow. There is still labor slack in our economy that we need to make up for. The reason that is this next slide here. Oil ran up to $130. Oil ran up to $100. Running up to $100 before the Russian-Ukraine crisis. The difference between $100 oil today and $100 oil of the past 5 years ago is what energy companies essentially did is they got really, really efficient at running their balance sheets. So they made their balance sheets super efficient. So they're very, very hesitant to increase their capital spending. So the chart you're looking at there, both those lines are, the blue line is your capital expenditure programs, and the black line is your price of oil that you would see on the screen. It's a very correlated line. The more money they're making, the more capital projects they're doing. The only time we see it decoupled is right now. So they're very hesitant to increase that capital expenditure program and that's why you see that slack in the economy right now from the employment growth, specifically more so for like the mining and up north guys. But that's where you're going to see the biggest gap right now, because they're just pretty hesitant right now to increase that capital expenditure programs until they see more fundamentally supported long-term prices. As soon as the prices start to rally, Russia and the Ukraine crisis happened, then it rallied to $130 oil. I do not envy being a forecaster right now. I've seen forecasts say like $40. I've seen forecasts say $300. That range is very wide, and economists love to say holding things constant. Well, nothing's been constant in these economies for like 5 years, right? So largely depends on what that's happening, and these companies, they know it as well. So that's why they're kind of tightening their balance sheets just a little bit. The price of oil, I touched on this already. It's sitting around that $90 mark. I'm very happy to see this here. It is a very, very well fundamentally supported price. And that's whether you're OPEC or this side of the border, it does not matter. This is a very supportive, strong supportive price for the economy. I will touch on, just kind of pair this back to what James was talking about from inflation. Commodity inflation, I don't mind. I call that upstream inflation. Upstream inflation is your commodity and energy. That is where you get higher prices, more corporate revenue, more wage growth, more employment and hiring, and then more corporate revenue and tax revenue from municipalities. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. The downstream inflation is the one that hurts. It's the price of the gas at the pump or going to buy groceries and feeling it. We obviously haven't lived through the 70s and 80s, and I think it's the first time that individuals our age are actually feeling the meaningful impact of inflation. We've always argued about inflation at 2%, but when it hits 8% and you see that material impact year over year, it hurts, right? But here for us in Alberta, it's not necessarily a bad story. Now, I'm going to now talk about, from an energy perspective, what's happening in the Russian-Ukraine crisis. Obviously, the humanitarian aspect of it is very bad. But if we actually look at what the impact of Russia is from an economic powerhouse, what reason we want to look at this data is because every time you look at what's happening on the news, it's a lot of volatility in the markets. So it's very important to look at the economic data to see how that supports everything else. Russia is a massive landmass, and it's got a really large vocal seat on the global stage. But from a GDP perspective, it's not exactly an economic powerhouse. You can kind of see if we take a look at the top producers in the world and kind of see where they rank, they're not even close to the top. So from an actual economic impact, they're not as big as you think they are. So the market will digest volatility no different than the past. It panics, and then it starts to digest the data afterwards. This is what they start to digest. Where they are obviously a massive player is in energy, oil and gas being the biggest one. The people that are going to have the biggest impact, Europe. They're obviously the biggest importers of the energy coming out of Russia. The biggest impact is going to be coming out of the Russian crisis is going to be Europe, because one, you sanction an entire geographical area, which is very bad. But however, when you sanction a certain geographical area, there's only so many areas that you can actually get these resources from. North America being one of the only other places that you can get a lot of those resources from. It's going to take time to get those commodities to that market. However, it is not that bad of a news story for us here in North America, strictly from an economics perspective. So obviously, when you increase the sanctions, all those prices spiked materially. What me and James realized is volatility is now a norm. Even going back 5 years, you had the oil crisis, Brexit, Trump, COVID, rising rates, and then Russia and Ukraine. Volatility is new age norm of what we're living in, and the market can just digest data that much faster, which is not necessarily bad in terms of Canada. Like I said, if I were to overlay a map of what Russia exports and what Canada exports and kind of overlay it, you're looking at that chart right now. It's a very close, I want to say mirror image, but there's a lot of overlap. So not only are people bullish and very strong North America, but here on this side of the border and the northern side, in terms of Canada, it's a positive news cycle. Even with stripping that out, even stripping out Russian-Ukraine crisis has been very good for Canada. And then you add that on top of it, it just supports the data that we've seen to have our my internal optimism data is, I guess, what I would say it is. Now, my internal optimism, James will kill me if I didn't have the other side of the coin put in there. So where we kind of see the biggest risks for the economy going forward to kind of push it, like I talked about, that narrow runway from a recessionary standpoint, where that recessionary standpoint, that narrow runway can get pushed into is the one, obviously, spiking oil prices a lot higher. You're talking about that $150 mark. That's something that can put pressure on the economy. Excessive rate hikes by the central banks. We don't see that as being a risk because we didn't put the chart in here, but to give you context, we're in a rising rate environment. The market's already priced that in. We can, like I said, the expected revenues are going higher. Next year, the market's pricing in rate cuts. So that shows you that the market's saying we're rising rates for a short amount of time, then we have to start cutting interest rates again next year. So I don't see the second one being that big of an impact. Financial markets and the wealth effect, that just means if the stock market continues to go down, everybody feels less wealthy. They stop spending money and they start saving more. That's all the wealth effect is. Inflation expectations build. So if inflation and supply chain disruptions take a lot longer, all that's going to do is delay when we get the recession, but a recession would come if those supply chain shortages don't start to kind of, if as James saying, we've peaked. If we haven't peaked, it's just going to delay when that recession kind of hits. The war in Ukraine spreads. Obviously, it's very isolated right now. That is an existential factor that we can't forecast, but if it does, obviously it's going to have a material impact that'll affect point one, which is the spike in oil prices. And the last is the new COVID variant. If you get something as transmissible as Omicron, but as deadly as Delta, that's going to cause China's zero COVID policy to shut down supply chains again. So that's one to watch as well. So those bullet points are the ones to watch when you're looking at the news in terms of actually causing a recession here in Canada and the States as well. With that, I'm going to stop for questions because we can talk about bonds and economics for way too long.
Well, thank you both. Certainly lots of data to absorb for sure. I was just curious with one thing. I guess from my perspective, you had suggested that just-in-time procurement was the cause of some of our woes here. And I would suggest that really that's not the cause. That just put it in our face sooner than what it could have if there was a larger supply on hand. All it did was bring it about quicker.
Yeah, so just-in-time delivery is just companies getting really efficient with not having to hold a lot of inventory because they don't want that cost. So when we say cause, we don't want to say like, that's why your projects have been like, that's why, but it is kind of an element to it because that's what created the supply chain bottleneck. And it's not just on the price of lumber. This is inventories across any supply chain that you look across out there. So it is an impact. The world transitioning to this just-in-time delivery situation. And I don't care if you're Walmart, Amazon, or lumber producers, they all kind of, it's kind of that Six Sigma operations management thing where you want to minimize your inventory to minimize your costs. So
no, I
reality
appreciate
is,
that. You just suggested that was the cause of some of it. The cause of it was goods not being made. The result of the just-in-time made it a reality sooner is all.
Yeah. Yes,
Exactly.
exactly. Yeah. It was the catalyst.
Yeah.
Yes.
Not seeing a tremendous amount of their lights on. Councillor Hoekstra?
Thanks, Mayor Creasy. So last week in the news, it was saying that houses in Ontario are dropping by like $500,000. What would we see in 2 weeks' time in terms of what you presented today? Like how much will that affect maybe 2 weeks is too short of a time, but yeah, that's got to be pretty significant in terms of inflation as well.
Absolutely, and I will say that like if you look at my the housing starts data, it's
Mhm.
already forecasted. That's the market's pricing kind of the prices that you're seeing on what you see in the news is the lagged effect of what's we're seeing in the data that's already put in the presentation today.
Right. I guess, so when you're saying housing starts, I see that as new builds though. Is that new builds? But that's still a number that you use to track even just the cost of a house? Is that a
No,
little bit?
it's a good question. It's very closely related. So
Okay.
I think to your point and Mr. Mayor's point is Alberta going to fare the same as BC and Ontario? From the data, it looks like not only are housing starts not falling, they're actually forecasted to increase a little bit next year, which you only start building a house if you think you can sell it for an attractive price, or you think there's going to be people that have demand for your project. So that's a positive for Alberta for sure. So that's kind of why we look at the housing start data, just because it kind of feeds into supply demand for houses. Yeah, a great
Thank
point.
you.
One of the hard-earned rewards, having suffered from 2015 or 16 on being energy dependent or work energy dependent in Alberta, I think it's only fitting that we recover quicker and stronger.
Absolutely. Like Chart said, I've been doing this 15 years. There haven't been too many years in the last decade where we come and have a positive news story, but it's a very interesting time. It's we were chatting last week with our chief economist. You know, can you please break down these? All of these things are intertwined, right? Inflation, housing prices, growth, interest rates. The biggest question is, can the central banks bring inflation back down without triggering recession? As Char mentioned, it's about a 30% chance they make a mistake, a policy mistake. The problem is it takes 6 months to a year before you can actually see the full impact of a rate hike. So it remains to be seen. Our chief economist seems to think that it is possible that you slow down inflation without triggering recession. But the good news for Alberta is that we're a little bit insulated. We're a little bit different than the rest of the country, and that the strong commodity prices should actually lend some good support to our growth.
Councillor Ross.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. So on the chart for consumer price index and end of 22, for Alberta, you see 5.7%, but then on an earlier chart, it was over 8.
Correct.
So if you
So
could-
good point. So that the over 8 would be the year-over-year change. So if we compared that exact point in time in say August to August last year, the difference is 8. But if we look at the average over the entire year, would be 5.7 would be forecast, and that's for Alberta, not as the nation as a whole. Hopefully that answers your question.
Councillor Connick.
Thank you, Mayor Chris. Yeah, further to that, Councillor Ross's question, of course, we've seen naturally a very high spike this year, but then they come down significantly in 2023. Are you still confident that that will occur? I guess obviously inflation is starting to come down, but is that a trend that you're confident in? Yeah.
That was a great point and a question that I asked the chief economist last week. So I think the fact that we're all questioning it means that nobody knows for real. Nobody knows for certain.
But to give you context of this is the number they're seeing, but let's look at the range, the upper and lower bound. I would say this is kind of tracking their forecast right now near the lower bound. Are they overconfident? Maybe, but the upper bound is still only about 2.25. It's not like an 8% mark going into next year. Because the one thing to remember, and James touched on it, is inflation, whether we like it or not, we can look at it in 600 different ways. How you actually materially affect impact is always going to be a monetary issue. It's all whether, and no matter how many ways we cut it, you raise rates, it's going to come down. When it comes down, how fast it comes down is what we said. It remains to be seen, but it's always going to be a monetary policy issue.
But a very difficult question to answer.
Councillor Hoekstra, did you have another question?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Creasy. So back to that rate of 5.7, then you also reference wages. And you said that, how did you word that? Something that there is a different, it's higher that, so if it's 5.7, but if it's going to drop next year, like if you give let's just say you give 6% increase, but yet next year's a huge drop. Isn't that then another increase in wages? Do you know where my brain is going? I'm not an economist, obviously.
I think, I mean, so the simplest way, if you're thinking about paying someone 100,000, you have to, like, the damage has already been done, right? There's been a jump in wages this year that
Right.
we have to adjust for. raising wages by 3% isn't gonna, accomplish making people whole.
You're always yeah, exactly what you said. You're always playing catch up and that bill's already being incurred. It just needs to be paid is another way to think about it, right? Yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's going to come down, but the 8% doesn't go away originally.
So the rate of growth in wages will slow, but it's still growing. So not only do you have to pay that person making 100, 108, you have to pay them even more the next year, right? So.
Councillor Hibbs.
Yes, just two questions. So furthermore to that, like, are you seeing that differentiate between sectors where you're getting, wage inflation, if you want to call that, or is it right across the board? I guess that would be my first question.
It's pretty broad-based. Yeah.
Okay.
Because even if you're like, say, public sector municipality, if someone in oil and gas is willing to pay my employee and take them, it affects everybody in the community, right?
Okay, just the reason I asked that is just because, I mean, the narrative that you hear out there is that it's, trying to attract workers back to the service industry is the hardest part right now. And so you're potentially seeing wage increases there, but not anecdotally hearing about that in other sectors is hence the question. Getting back to interest rates, I did note that this chart only goes to December 2023 when talking about like the overnight target rate, et cetera. But I believe you mentioned that sort of the expectation is past that you would start to see that number decrease. Was that what I understood correctly? And could you just elaborate on that a little bit? Like what would the maybe the year or two after that potentially look like or most likely look like? Again, we know economics is not a hard science. It's a little bit of a educated guess at times.
Yeah, so well, while I bring this up, the one thing to remember is, and I'm pretty sure James, you might be going into this, but the market has already priced in a significant portion of both the rate increase and then the expected decrease as well. But I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, I think this graph answers your question. The market is pricing in the central bank raising rates to about 3.25 this year, which is why if I'm going to invest for a year, I demand at least 3.25. But the fact that this slopes down sharply after that, if we go out 3, 5, 7 years, that rate goes from 3.25 back down to 2.75. So it's the market's pricing in a 50 basis point cut. But that's a best estimate, right, from the market. It'll depend on if there's a recession, how sharp it is, because they'll have to cut faster if that happens. But yeah, beyond 2023, this is telling us in the next 3 years, they're going to cut rates. Great question.
Thank you both for coming to present to us. We appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you all very much for having us.
J.L. Gowdy, you had suggested that perhaps you would like some time. Was this after this item or after the presentation by Senior McKinnon, Manager McKinnon? Okay, thank you. So that brings us down to reports to committee. Item 4.1, Senior Manager McKinnon, the operating budget outlook to discuss some direction for budget 2023. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor Creasy and Council. This fall, Council is scheduled to adopt the 2023 operating and the 2023 capital budget, along with approving a 3-year operating and a 10-year capital plan for the City of Lacombe. The purpose of this committee meeting is for Council to provide direction to administration on budget targets, as well as the level of property tax rate increase for 2023. So tonight I will provide some information to Council to guide administration on what the 2023 budget targets should be. I will begin with a recap of the 2022 approved budget targets. Then I'll highlight the Council policies that relate to the budget directly, and finally focus on the potential changes in revenue and expenses for 2023. 2022 recap of approved budgets. So in 2022, the city's operating budget, including transfers from reserves and internal transfers, was 43.6 million. And there's an operating revenue and expense charts that were attached to your report that show the breakdown of those by category. City staffing levels remained really stable in 2022. The personnel changes included a conversion of 3 part-time staff to full-time status. The 2022 final approved capital budget was 12.1 million. This included approved changes increases of 1.7 million for the Public Works facility, a 200,000 increase for planning a South Ring Road connector, and an additional 62,000 for pavement costs related to the City Hall parking lot. The 2022 capital budget categorized by funding source is also attached in a report tonight. In 2022, Bylaw 491 special paving tax also was introduced to help fund the road maintenance deficit. The administration recommends keeping the paving tax equivalent to 1% of the general tax in 2023 and increasing the transfer to roads reserves by 1% annually. This is detailed in a separate report to committee at this meeting. So there are 4 council policies that tie into the budget preparation. The first policy is the annual budget and taxation policy. Section 4B of the council's adopted policy states the city shall use the July 1st Alberta Consumer Price Index as a targeted property tax rate increase. The June 2022 Alberta CPI was 8.4%. This means the average cost of goods purchased in June 2022 was 8.4% higher than the same basket of goods purchased in June 2021. A 1% tax rate increase will generate approximately $160,000 in additional tax revenue. An 8.4 tax rate increase translates to approximately $1.3 million in additional tax revenue. The second policy is the compensation policy. The city's compensation policy outlines the city's philosophy for determining the annual cost of living adjustment and market adjustments for staff. Policy states the cost of living allowance will be equivalent to the Alberta Consumer Price Index, calculated based on the average of the Alberta CPI increases from the 12 months from July 1st to June 30th. So the average Alberta CPI increases for the 12 months from July 2021 to June 2022 is 5.4%. The third policy is the council remuneration policy. In 2022 or 21, I said council revised the city's council remuneration expense policy. This policy outlines the city's philosophy for determining compensation for members of council. In every budget year, council's remuneration will be adjusted as per the policy at the discretion of council. Additional reviews may be done internally with consultant support or by a citizen remuneration committee. Remuneration shall focus on equitable and reasonable compensation for duties performed on city's behalf by members of council. The fourth policy applicable is the debt management fiscal policy. Section 4 of this policy limits the municipality to 75% of the debt limit established by provincial regulations, MGA, and 75% of the debt service limit established by provincial regulations. Also, the policy states that the debt servicing costs for tax supported debt will not exceed 20% of the taxes available for municipal purposes. Currently, the city's debt stands at almost 59% of the municipal debt limit, or 44% of the MGA limit, and the city has a 41% debt limit available, or can borrow an additional 16.5 million and remain within council policy. The debt servicing repayment of principal and interest is approximately 2 million per year. This is well within the 6.6 million limit set by council policy, leaving $4.6 million of debt servicing remaining before council debt limit or servicing limit has been reached. The city is well below the maximum debt servicing limit for tax supported operations of 3.2 million. Approximately 1.6 million of the current debt servicing is for tax supported services. In conclusion, the city is well within the debt and servicing limits of the MGA and the council debt management policy. The estimated cost of borrowing $1 million today would require repayments of principal and interest of $68,000 a year for 25 years or $62,000 a year for a 30-year term. The long-term debt outstanding as of December 31st, 2021 is 23.6 million, with an average interest rates locked in well below what we could borrow for today. A key funding source for capital projects is the use of the city's reserves. Financial reserves are set aside to maintain and support assets through their life cycle. Contributions are made annually through the operation budget to fund capital reserve accounts. Based on a 10-year average of capital expenditures, the inflationary impact of future capital projects requires an increase in reserve contributions. The attached 2023 reserve and grant chart shows funds currently set aside to fund the 2023 capital budget and to contribute to the 10-year capital plan. The known budget risks for 2023 include Obviously, inflationary impacts on goods and services, shortages of required supplies, limited resources, supply chain disruptions, increased construction costs, increased cost of borrowing, inflationary impacts on future capital projects, asset deterioration due to deferred maintenance, rehab, or restoration, a reduction in MSI grant in 2022 and 2023 also reduced funding available for delivery of the 10-year plan. And the MSI grant ends in 2023 and will be replaced by the local government fiscal framework grant beginning in 2024. And we're uncertain of the allocation at this point. Now I will talk about the changes in revenue expenses projected from 2022. In 2023, the estimated changes in revenue expenses included a $300,000 increase in revenue and a $2.2 million increase in expenses. The revenue change included new revenue for lagoons water storage, safety inspections, and growth in municipal assessment. The expenditure change includes inflationary increases for electricity, natural gas, and fuel, increased software licenses and professional services, increase to the contribution to the fleet and roads reserve, service level increases including snow clearing policy amendments, increased weed reclamation and tree pruning. Personnel increases including 5.4% COLA for council and staff, grade increases, and new position requests. The net expenditure increase, revenue minus expenses for 2023 is forecasted to be 1.9 million, or equivalent to a 12% tax rate increase. The anticipated net increase of 12% tax rate increase exceeds the annual budget and taxation preparation policy by 3.6%. One item that has not yet been factored in is the franchise fees, which may impact revenues depending on the impact of the median rate and any council decisions related to that. In conclusion, the City of Lacomb's 2023 projected net expenditures are 1.9 million higher than the 2022 net budget of 43.6 million. The net increase represents a 12% tax rate increase, and council's policy suggests an adopted tax rate of 8.4% increase. Therefore, projected net expenditures suggest an increase of 3.6 higher than the adopted policy. Tonight, administration seeks council's direction on setting a budget target or tax rate increase to help us prepare for the 2023 operating and capital budget. Council will need to consider directing a reduction in proposed expenses, tax stabilization through a withdrawal of the operating reserve, a variance from a budget and taxation preparation policy, or some combination thereof. Thank you for your attention, and I'm grateful to answer any questions you may have.
Appreciate that presentation. Chief Administrator Officer, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Senior Manager McKinnon. To see there, 12% is within under 4% away from your policy. We have prepared, and I will say, we could easily hit your policy. I'm confident we can do that. We've prepared this using your adopted policies as a guide. As you've heard tonight, we are in kind of a weird spot where the spot inflation and using the spot inflation on a June to June basis results in an inflation number that might not actually play out that way over the average of the months. Interestingly, you have adopted a philosophy for compensation that looks at the 12-month average over that time. When I look at 8.4% increase, that would actually, barring Councillor Dallas, that would be more than twice. I can't think of 2 years consecutively that would add to an 8.4% tax increase that the rest of council has passed. And so I have some expectation that council will seek to target something actually less than your policy might identify at 8.4. So, you know, as I said, we have prepared this. My best advice to you, though, knowing the finances of the organization quite well, I think between Manager McKinnon and I, we have a good handle on it. I would say a reasonable target is to, or a reasonable approach would be to say to administration, yeah, we do want you to look at these things. Obviously, a reduction in proposed expenses. Again, when I look at $590,000 of new staffing requests, that would be more than we've added in any given year in the past. And it's much more important in my mind to treat your existing staff well and retain them before adding new staff that you might not be able to pay competitively in a rising inflation market. So you look at a reduction in proposed expenses, I'm expecting to get that kind of direction, or we're expecting to get that direction, obviously. Tax stabilization. So there we're saying, let's look at some of our one-time expenses that we're anticipating. So it might be a municipal census or things like that, and look at a withdrawal from the operating reserve that you've been fortunate enough and wise enough to build up over the last, I don't know, 5 years to nearly $2 million. These are extraordinary times that maybe, I'm not a big fan of tax rate stabilization of non-coverable funds. I don't know what the rate of reserve funds. But there is some rationale here that things might look different a year from now. And if they don't, well, maybe it's a smaller dial at that time. Looking at an 8.5% tax rate increase this year, yes, it's a good economy in Alberta. That doesn't mean it's a good economy in everyone's household. When you have these rising inflationary costs, you have more expensive mortgages, more expensive vehicles. I think looking for ways that we can come in under that 8.4 is important. So I would say directing us to look at some, and a variance, excuse me, a variance from the budget and taxation preparation policy. In this case, actually a variance to the good, where you would say, you know what, target 5.4. I want to align the philosophy between COLA and the tax rate setting, because it doesn't really make sense to have 8.4 and, is it 8.4 and 5.4? That's right. Yes. 8.4 and 5.4, they should be the same philosophy. I think that with that direction, we would be able, it would be some work, but I think that's an achievable target that we can come back to and say, okay, here's something that reflects the average of inflation over the last 12 months, sorry, and is less than your policy would guide us to achieve. And it's something you can show to the community. Hey, the adopted tax rate increase is actually like 50% less than what our policy would say when we align to inflation. I don't want you to think that this is kind of like we can make it. We have looked at this. We've talked about it quite extensively. I think that 5.4 is probably an achievable number. We don't really want to get into a situation where we talked about this, preparing multiple scenarios where, you know, we do entire budgets of an 8.4 and then a 5.4. I think that the value of having this summer pre-budget meeting is to prepare us so that we come in aligned with something that the council is looking to fine tune, but not offended by, or, you know, just totally not aligned on. So that would be my recommendation, is to look at something 5.4, the combination of these three strategies. And then I would also say we should look at probably adjusting the actual policy so that in future years, like, I think that is actually a better idea to do the 12-month average than a sort of a spot price today. It also happens to be quite beneficial this year if you choose to adopt it. So I will answer any questions, as will Senior Manager McKinnon. We're here to help support your discussion.
Thank you very much for that. I think that the vast majority of council is going to see that as a positive move to tone things down a bit here. One thing I did notice is that certainly in all of the personnel is in a significant portion of the operating costs of the city. However, when I look here, we're talking $1.6 million out of a net expenditure increase of $2.1 million. It seems a little heavily, a little over the top geared towards those increases. And even with the new positions off of there, which is substantial at 600,000, like you mentioned, I think there might be some more justification here, both for a 5.5 COLA and the reclassifications for there, because it is a significant impact. I don't think we could afford all the rope that we would need from the community to consider this, but I think this is a great starting point as per our policy. And while I don't think that our policy, I think the intent of our existing policy was good. It worked far better in years when things were a little more even keeled, whereas the spikes that we're experiencing now is difficult at best. Councillor Ross?
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. As I addressed a question earlier of the 5.7, this obviously could be swallowed a lot easier than 8 point whatever one that was in the media. And I think people initially think of inflation as what they hear, what's being informed to them through the media. So I think this is far more responsible. I do think we have to, as we look at our staff, I think for our administration, as we've lost some wonderful people, but sometimes you have to evaluate the individual just has an opportunity that is not currently available here. So, but in the same respect, I would like to focus on having that opportunity to retain our staff, so it's easier administration, so it's not, don't have to deal with transitions, like I said. Like, so I strongly support that the difference between the initial shock of what was expecting than what we have offered here. So yeah, but I would more lean towards of our staff retention of our existing staff than having to go to more hires. Possibly there's some areas within our operation that you might have to start consulting or contracting or something that's, it just, so yeah, but unfortunately it is what it is today. So I really support this approach. So thank you.
Thank you. I thought there were some interesting points made in the presentation, and perhaps I'm just looking at a different perspective. I don't see a mass exodus of municipal employees. I don't just mean just in Macomb, but anywhere into private enterprise. Overall, it's generally the other way around. Private enterprise moving into government, especially municipal. So to suggest that that's the only way that we can retain people is by paying more, I think is an oversimplification of reality. Is the most polite way I can put it. There are lots of other factors that play into it as well. Of course, people need to be compensated. That's goes without saying, but that is not something that I have witnessed is a mass exodus of people from municipal government going to private enterprise because they're being paid more. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I just have not witnessed that. Councillor Connick?
Thank you, Mayor Christie. Yeah, naturally, CEO Gowdy, you've identified already areas that are ripe for cuts and expense and new hires and so forth. And you guys do a pretty good job of identifying areas that could be, or we could trim some expense. I agree with aligning with the 5.4, the average, as opposed to the one-off. 5.4 though is still significant. Yes, I agree we should do a COLA, but I'm not sure we can do a 5.4. I would much rather do a lower number, and then with the idea being that if CPI is projected to be 1.8 next year as per the presentation, then maybe we can go a little higher than CPI next year to try and recoup where we've cut from the 5.4 this year. You know what I'm trying to say? So I don't know what that number is. I don't think 5.4 is doable. Is it half that? I don't know. As you alluded to, I think you had said it yourself, CEO Gowdy, not every household in this community is experiencing the Alberta advantage, so to speak. And, you know, every time we do a tax increase, whether it's 1, 2, last year was just over 2, we still heard it, right? It was still high, you know, and a lot of people said that's, you know, it's, so, yeah, I don't know what the number is. I'm curious to see what others say, but I agree that there has to be an increase, but whether, I don't think 5.4 is going to cut.
Councillor Ross?
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. I do, I guess, understand the thoughts on are people transitioning from private to public or public to private. I think even since COVID, I think people are looking for quality of life. Can you have a lower increase? I'm just throwing a number out, hypothetically 4% instead of 5.4 COLA. But structurally within the organization, you could accommodate through HR, accommodate some staff. Could some staff, does it work for them? Are they as efficient at home? Or do we go in public works and say, hey, do you want to go back to work in 4/12s, 4 on, 4 off? Or do you want to work 4/10s and have 3-day weekends? I think nowadays people are really looking at quality of life as for, it's not all about money. Can we be more creative within our administration and all of our staff to make it more attractive to want to work with the city without costing as much COLA? Like, is there options? I guess that way. I think I'm just throwing out ideas because I think it's different since COLA. I think people are looking at life differently. It's just what you hear. So.
Does anyone else have any questions? Councillor Gullickson?
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. I just, to Councillor Connick's, when you were saying that the 5.4 was too high, was that on the tax increase on the COLA side? You thought it was too high?
Well, ultimately, in years previous, whatever amount we give to COLA usually translates the same
To the
in terms of taxing.
taxation?
And maybe there's a way we could do that where that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I just think that I think you're going to be seeing some larger increases in salaries as companies try and attract more staff higher than this 5.4 that we're looking at. Certainly, I would like to see it lower also, but I'm not sure that's possible. And hopefully we would have some numbers from the public sector before we have to make this decision, or would we? Possibly not. I mean, timing is going to be poor, I think.
It's very tough because your competitors, if you want to use that term, are making the same decisions at the same time. And I should point out, I mean, it is real money and it's a material difference to go from 4 to 5.4 to 2.7 or whatever you had talked about. However, I think these factors are really important, what Councillor Ross brought up. I also think you have a process in place for your compensation strategy with staff that periodically you go to the market and do a comparison anyway. So it will be corrected, whether that's a 1% dial up or a 1% dial down. It only goes 2 or 3 years. So it really, you're not going to make a catastrophic mistake somehow by going 1% too high or 1% too low. I think staff will see the council is trying to do what they can, balancing a lot of different factors and appreciate whatever is extended to help them deal with inflation.
Thank you for reminding us of that. I actually was approached by more staff than usual who's expressed appreciation for the COLA that was decided upon even last year. Not to suggest that's an appropriate number for this year, but our staff generally does, I think, appreciate the strain that the budget is under. And let's face it, everybody would like more money. That's a given. But I think that they are realistic in their expectations as well, something that I appreciate from them and has been expressed to me over this last year. Did you have a follow-up?
Well, I just was going to say, you know, I feel that we have to be careful and, you know, retaining our staff will be very important to us in the next number of years. And hopefully this isn't going to be a catalyst for, if we do go lower number, I hope it won't be a catalyst to see us lose some important employees. That's all.
Councillor Connick?
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. I would agree with you, Councillor Gullickson, but I also agree with the mayor in that I don't think, could we see the private sector, like, I don't see an oil and gas company poaching our financial services manager, maybe, or a greater operator, maybe, I don't know. I agree there'll be some pressures there. And I agree we have to do some sort of a COLA. I don't know what the number is. I'm not opposed to another point in your presentation, Manager McKinnon, to utilizing some reserves. It's always a little tricky, but we are a little bit healthy there. So I'm not opposed. I'm just floating it out there to dipping in there as a one-off this year to try and achieve a COLA that we think will benefit our employees. But that's all I have to say.
Councillor Hoekstra?
Thanks, Mayor Creasy. First of all, excellent presentation. It made tons of sense. I remember that feeling that I didn't know where we were headed. And this was very good. And I do like that these are our policies. But I also appreciate what CEO Gowdy is saying, and that the average of 12 months is a way to aim at that place. I sit on the police commission, so I guess I would rather we didn't go too low on the COLA. I think that there's an expectation there. Well, anyhow, I better be careful in what I say there, but I would say I wouldn't want to go lower than 5.
Councillor Hibbs?
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. Yeah, this just not good news all the way around. So, I mean, I do agree that definitely something needs to be done because the numbers per policy would just be unpalatable. I will point out, I think it's already been pointed out before, that we've had, you know, what our guiding principle is, then we've had what we actually decided on a tax increase historically, at least this council, we've always been a little bit below, and I would definitely be expecting council to continue with that. And then I would also note that COLA also was lower again, so they didn't necessarily match. So, I mean, I totally agree with that these are unusual circumstances, and that's why you essentially have a rainy day fund. And I feel like that's something that we definitely need to be considering, because if you're like, I do think that this is an opportunity for some of that smoothing that we were talking about. So I think that's definitely what we should be looking at. I get it that we want to be doing right by our employees, absolutely 100%. However, that being said, I think that expectation needs to be reasonable. I mean, I guess some people are getting raises, but lots of people aren't. I mean, I'm not, like at my other job, right? So, and there's lots of people in this city that are in that boat too. So how are they going to pay for their property tax? Are they going to get a third job too? Like, it's just, I think that we have to do our very best to beat down those increases as much as possible. That's what our residents are demanding. A lot of people, maybe it won't make as big of a deal for them, but this is going to be significant for a lot, where they're counting down at the end of the month right now. You know, they've got $100 left in their account, and they've got 2 weeks to go. And what are they going to eat? You know, what is that electricity bill going to look like? Because the fans have been running like nonstop for the last month. So that is my expectation. I don't know what the number is, but I know that I will definitely not be happy if it's anywhere near 5.4 for either of those two numbers. It's just, it's not acceptable. We have to think about the people in this community that will be hugely, hugely affected by that. It's not a matter of canceling a winter vacation. It's, I can't afford to feed my kids this month. So those are the people we have to keep in mind.
Are there any other questions or comments? Councillor Ross.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. Obviously, there's no motions in a committee meeting, but for direction, our administration going by the discussion of 5 to 5.5, or like, or is this? They want direction, so.
And that's certainly a fair comment. Thank you for that. I think that from the discussion that's had, I think that CEO Gowdy has a rough indication of where we lie, and that the path that they was on to reduce from what the policy is going to be a good starting point. There's certainly going to be some additional fine tuning as we move forward, but I don't know that picking a specific number out of the hat right now is necessarily in anyone's best interest. Chief Gowdy?
Over.
Councillor Conick?
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. Is it fair to say, Mayor Creasy, that the majority of council is okay with in seeking that target to utilize some of our reserves? Is that fair or no? Or will that be part of what you bring forward? See,
I'll start with that. To be perfectly honest with you, I believe you're the only individual that referenced that. So I don't know that, I certainly don't have a clear indication of what council's expectation is. I think that deciding on where we can be is the first step, and then deciding where that money comes from, perhaps will follow, if would seem reasonable in my opinion. But if you have an alternative, that would be fine.
no, I was just, I kind of sensed from Councillor Hoopster, she was okay. Maybe Councillor Hibbs, you're right, not the majority. Anyways, thank you.
Councillor Hoopster.
So just a comment, I mean, when I look at our previous years, what we've done, the last 2019 to now 2022, we don't have a really nice little pattern that we followed, unfortunately. But when it is over 8 and we're considering 5.4, that's a almost a 3% drop. Or it is a 3% drop. I don't know. I just can't see us dropping even further because we never dropped to that kind of percentage drop in previous years.
I don't think of it as a drop as a 5% gain.
Well, look at you. Yeah. It's just, this is really tough. And I guess I still want to say, I appreciate it when when I was walking this morning, I'm going 12%, and then to suddenly at this discussion be at 5.4. That's pretty significant. I guess you did my heart well, but whether that with anything to do with my heart, I should be smarter.
They don't need to be in the room to quote you. No. Sounds like that is all of the questions and comments we have for the operating budget pre-discussion, I'm going to call it. Is that fair? Then let's move on to item 4.2, the sustainable road maintenance topic. Chief Gowdy?
So tonight I'm presenting for council's consideration tax strategy for incorporating the special paving tax into your commitment to continue to sustainably fund road maintenance. So essentially, what we have come to now, having been through a first round of the special paving tax, I should say we had anticipated not a lot of opposition, but some. And instead, we received one letter from, I believe, a former councillor who said, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, that's a tax increase, which he is not incorrect on. So I don't know that at 1%, you're likely to generate significant public interest or feedback, which would result in potentially in a legal challenge of the applicability of the tax. What we have seen when we looked at another instance of this is that there have been successful challenges of these special paving taxes when they're raised for very general purpose statements. So paving or road maintenance, it has to be tied to a named project that is of general municipal benefit that uses at least the entire amount raised from that year's special paving tax. And so where we see this being problematic is not in the passing of a 1% or a 2% even, but once you get up to a 5% and eventually a 10% tax rate, special paving tax that's equal to $1.5 million, that is probably going to motivate some public resistance to the special taxation. You would be better served, I think it's more sustainable to look at on an annual basis, incorporating the previous year's special paving tax revenue into your general municipal requisition and directing that money as a flow through into your roads reserve, because then you can use it as kind of this general roads program money, and it greatly lowers your risk of legal challenge. This is compliant, it's legislatively compliant, and what we've proposed is that you would go actually beyond the minimum standards for notifying people about the special paving tax and continue to notify them through a direct mailed brochure, as we did this year, that identifies the purpose of the special paving tax, gives them information on how they can find out more information or ask questions or even potentially petition it down. And it's an annual reminder, I guess, that they are being subject to an extraordinary tax that is specifically intended to result in improved roadways. So they know that the council is making a commitment that roadways are particularly important. We've adopted this plan, an asset management strategy, an asset management policy, and a mechanism to sustainably fund roadways. I would say there's a prioritization of paving and roadway maintenance with this council, and that's reflected in the annual change or the annual notification. The other thing it does, it lowers the incentive in the future. It kind of locks that revenue in for reserve, road reserve contributions. And if in the future council decides, actually, I'm not into the special paving tax anymore, for whatever reason, it could be this council, it could be a future council, it's a tough year. It's a small change to make. It doesn't drastically suddenly change your revenue for 1 year to where you're locked into a decision that you may want to make. But for those that may recall the automated traffic enforcement cancellation, you may want to make the decision. It's still a painful one. To wipe out a major revenue source is very difficult. That removes that risk from you without tying the hands or binding the actions of future councils. They still have the opportunity to make that change whenever they want. So I have laid out an example that kind of goes through it. The numbers are actually within the ballpark of reality for your municipality at $15 million of general municipal requisition. They have been simplified, of course, a bit. The budget we've presented to you includes this incorporation of the previous special paving tax into the general municipal requisition. And we're recommending that that be the plan going forward, that you would continue to pass a 1% special paving tax, but each year incorporate the revenue raised into your general municipal requisition. It certainly is a way, just to be very transparent, it's increasing taxes potentially beyond CPI. That is happening. It is being transparent about it though by saying, hey, we're doing so in a special way for paving. And so it does both of those things.
Thanks, Chief Cody. Yeah, for me, I mean, more tax is more tax, plain and simple. However, with those dollars specifically earmarked for roadway development, redevelopment, whatever we're terming it, I still think that's a very clear and accurate way of letting our citizens know where those funds are going. Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody's under any cloud that this is somehow not a tax or not. And I have no problem with incorporating that into the regular requisition on an annual basis, provided that those dollars are specifically earmarked for the purpose of which they were initially intended. And by saying that, if it ended in pick 3 years, call it, I don't know, just any number, those dollars are on the 4th year, that increase would still be going towards roadways. Because we don't have it on the 4th, on the year after, it's theoretically ending. No, I appreciate that, but all the initial still does. Okay, I just wanted to make that perfectly clear because that's a pretty big item. Councillor Conick?
Thank you, Mayor Christie. So to be clear then, initially it was proposed that we were going to do a 1% year over year that would increase. This year would be 2, next year 3 or 4. Like
3 then 4. Sorry, 3 then 4 all the way up to 10.
Okay, so what you're proposing now is the 150,000 we raised this year, we would continue to do that every year, add it to our bottom line, and it would incrementally increase, like by year 5, it's at 153 as opposed to 100.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, that's far more palatable than the year over year 1% increase for sure. And I think that's, and even if we don't, I think it's easier to even call it 1%. It's just 150,000 every year. Like, I guess we have to call it a special tax, but anyways, this is more palatable to me than our original intent with this, so.
Councillor Hoekstra?
Thanks, Mayor Creasy. Help me out here though. If I was a citizen, where does that 15 million originally come from? Like, what does that mean? General municipal requisition?
That's just property taxes that are raised through the normal tax.
Okay, I was thinking that was particularly tied to roads. No, okay.
So normally you pass a tax rate bylaw, I think it was bylaw 491 or 496. And so you'll raise general municipal requisition, then there's some for affordable housing, libraries, and education. And then you have separately the special. So your general municipal requisition is actually a subset of your property tax, is why it's phrased that way. So.
Anyone else? Councillor Gluckson?
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. So we're going to have a 5.4% increase in tax, municipal tax, maybe, or maybe a.
Plus this.
Well, yes, plus that. And we're going to fight over the 5.4, get it down to 4.9 or whatever. And then this just goes on automatically. The extra 1%.
I don't think
Well, not
automatically is
automatically.
necessarily.
No, but I mean, I know it's not gonna be automatic, but it's just, to me, I like the idea of this a lot, like the define, so it's defined where this money's going. It's easier to justify. When I had complaints about it from some citizens, it was easy to justify saying this is going directly to paving. And they're seeing it this year a lot with the program that we're running. And so I think it's been well received. I just don't want it to be any, misconception about it at all when we're out there. And I like the idea of being very transparent on the long term of it also. And I mean, realistically, like if we get our tax down to 4.5 or whatever it is, then it'll be a 5.5% increase with this 1%, correct? Yeah, so. I mean, it's just as long as it's right up front, that's all that matters.
Don't see any other comments or questions. So while I let council ponder any additional items, I'll go through our next meetings so that anybody watching is aware of them. On Monday, August 22nd is a regular council meeting. By the way, all of these meetings are at 5:30 p.m. here at City Hall. So again, Monday, August 22nd, Monday, September the 12th is another one. And then on September 26th as well. So I would suggest everyone verify in their calendars. I had a bit of a hiccup with my own, and thanks to our legislative coordinator, I think we've got that straightened out. So thank you for that. Just to reiterate, did anybody else come up with any questions for the road maintenance items for Chief Cowdy? If not, Councillor Hoekstra.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. So I'm still a little tucked. I don't know why I'm challenged by this little chart. So have we proposed that we're going to contribute more to roads reserves? Is that why that's increasing each time too? So if a citizen says, so we got this 1%, 150,000, where does that increased 150 coming to the contribution to the reserve? Where's that coming from?
That is from the previous special paving tax. So
The
this
previous.
year's budget
Okay.
will show an extra 150,000.
That's where got it. Okay, thank you. See, my brain was not.
I believe that's all the business that we had for this evening. That is, of course, unless we're just interested in hanging out longer. Councillor Hoekstra.
Just for the record, I don't want to keep doing this, but anyhow, I make a motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Record will reflect. Made at 7 p.m. All those in favor? It's unanimous.